2026 Summer Speakers Series. Our presenter tonight is Dr. John Krueger. John Krueger is a longtime heritage advocate, having started as a guide at Fort Ticonderoga in 1970. He is a prolific writer and gifted storyteller whose animated talks have sparked a deeper appreciation for the Lake Champlain Basin region's cultural heritage. Originally from Schenectady, John received his doctorate in history from the University at Albany after attending Boston University and the University of Vermont for his undergraduate and master's studies. John worked at UVM as a professor of history. He served as the director of the Clinton County Historical Association, the director of the Kent-Delord House Museum, and city historian for Plattsburgh. John Krueger lives in Fort Ticonderoga. Please welcome Dr. John Krueger.
I suggested to Garth that I didn't need that really long introduction. Just say that I was a history guy and leave it at that. But we'll see how it goes. Why does history matter? It matters because liberty is not self-sustaining. Freedom must first be imagined in the minds and hearts of a people, then declared with conviction, defended at great cost, and sustained across generations. So tonight, in a region shaped by Lake Champlain, we gather not simply to honor the past, but to recognize a central truth. I got to tell you right now, quick station break. You're going to know most of what I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to mix it up, so perhaps it'll give you a different perspective on what you already know. We gather not simply to honor the past, but to recognize a central truth. Real people in real places carried the American Revolution forward. And one of these places was Valcour Island. What happened there helped determine whether the new United States would survive. That is why this story matters. It is, in every sense, our pride of place. David McCullough, one of America's most honored authors, was the recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 National Book Awards, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. McCullough urged his audiences to read history, to see where we've come from and where we're going. History, he believed, teaches chiefly by example. It steadies us in uncertain times, reminds us what is worth standing up for, and helps us feel those who came before us were not remote figures in a distant past, but living men and women confronting choices no less real than our own. That is why history still speaks with authority to the present. Keep in mind that the past is not history, Joseph Ellis reminds us, but a much vaster region of the dead, gone, unknowable, or forgotten. History is what we choose to remember. David McCullough said there's no secret to making history come alive. His friend Barbara Tuchman, herself a 2-time Pulitzer recipient, put it in 2 words: tell stories. So tonight I want to tell a few stories about people who imagined liberty, declared it, and defended it. And in doing so, they gave liberty form and staying power. Taken together, these stories point to a larger truth. Freedom endures only when conviction becomes action, and when action rises to meet decisive moments in decisive places. Remember, the revolution did not begin with the crack of muskets. In 1818, John Adams asked, "What do we mean by the revolution? Do we mean the American War?" His answer was no. The revolution was effected before the war commenced. It began, he said, in the minds and hearts of the people. For Adams, the true revolution was a transformation in principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections. Yet ideas alone would not secure independence. Those ideas would have to be tested in action and defended in places, including the waters around Valcour Island, where the fate of the cause would hang in the balance. The home in which John Adams was born in 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts, a dozen miles south of Boston, still stands. Adams entered Harvard at 16, graduated in 1755, taught school briefly, studied law, and married Abigail Smith in 1764. 9 years younger, Abigail was a parson's daughter from neighboring Weymouth, whose abilities complemented and equaled his own. Theirs became a 54-year partnership of mind and character, central to the revolutionary generation. She was his closest political collaborator. Their lives remind us that the revolution was led not by abstractions, but by disciplined citizens, shaped by family, education, duty, and conviction. John Adams understood something essential. In his generation, politics and war were not pursued for their own sake. Politics and war were the difficult but necessary means of securing a future in which others could live freely, learn, create, and thrive. "I must study politics and war," he once wrote, "that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, commerce, and agriculture, to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, and porcelain." As things turned out, this was pretty much what happened. Politics and war became the necessary work of preserving liberty. Joseph Warren was one of the great animating spirits of the Revolution, though his death at the misnamed Battle of Bunker Hill has often overshadowed the full measure of his service. Physician, organizer, political leader, and patriot, he moved easily between Boston's households and the councils of resistance. He did not merely witness the revolution, he helped bring it into being. Born in Roxbury in 1741, he entered Harvard at 14, graduated in 1759, trained in medicine, and opened a Boston practice in 1763. The following year, he inoculated John Adams for smallpox, beginning a friendship that would last for the remainder of the doctor's life. Warren saw everyone, from leading patriots to enslaved patients, often providing smallpox inoculations free of charge. He saved 7-year-old John Quincy Adams' badly fractured finger from amputation. Decades later, John Quincy fondly reminisced about Warren, a dear friend of my father and a beloved physician to me. William Emerson, minister of Concord's Congregational Church, belonged to the generation that fused faith, civic duty, and patriot resolve. By the eve of the Revolution, he'd become more than just a local pastor. Emerson's trusted voice helped prepare ordinary people for extraordinary demands. Born in Malden, just north of Boston in 1743, he entered Harvard at 14. You're seeing a theme here, at least in the beginning. Graduated in 1761, taught school while studying theology, and in 1766 accepted a call to Concord, where the minister had recently died. The young clergyman boarded with his predecessor's widow and soon married her 24-year-old daughter, Phoebe Bliss. Shortly after the birth of their son, In 1769, the new father built a graceful frame home called the Manse in a field overlooking the town's North Bridge. 3 daughters followed at 2-year intervals. As his family and ministry grew, William Emerson impressed his parishioners with his liberal religious views and patriotic zeal. Spring arrived early to New England in 1775, after one of the mildest winters in memory. The light snows of January and February scarcely muffled the sounds of the militia drill. Concord's fiery minister called it extraordinary weather for warlike preparations. On March 13th, after a militia muster, Emerson preached from Chronicles. Behold, God is with us for our captain. He believed his people's cause was the Lord's cause, and that victory would follow if they held to their faith. 5 weeks later, their faith was put to the test. On the afternoon of April 18th, British troops in Boston mobilized. Joseph Warren learned an expedition would likely set out that night, and dispatched Paul Revere to alert the countryside. British soldiers were headed to Concord. Warren slipped out of town early on the morning of April 19th and helped coordinate military efforts throughout the day. Fighting as a volunteer beside General William Heath, he narrowly escaped death when a musket ball struck the pin from his earlock. When his mother begged him not to risk his life again, Warren replied, "Where danger is, dear mother, there will your son be. Now is no time for one of America's children to shrink from the most hazardous duty. I will either set my country free or shed my last drop of blood to make her so." Meanwhile, at Concord, a little before 2 on the morning of April 19th, the bell atop the meeting house began to clang in the dark. Young Dr. Samuel Prescott had arrived with the alarm. "The regulars are coming out." Half a mile away in the manse, Parson Emerson heeded the warning and hurried into the village, among the first to answer the call. Later in the day, as frightened townspeople fled to the manse, he moved among the women and children, offering bread, cheese, and comfort. Then the highly respected minister passed among the militia, speaking words of encouragement to the young soldiers. William Emerson's diary entry for April 30th reads, "This month remarkable for the greatest events taking place in the present age." John Adams was not a man of violence. Shocked by news of the fighting at Lexington and Concord, and troubled by how it began, he saddled his horse and rode off to see for himself. He picked his way past burial parties, burned out houses, refugees, and marching soldiers. Though Braintree was not far from Lexington, Adams later remembered the ride as one of the great intellectual journeys of his life. He returned home, convinced that the die was cast, the Rubicon crossed, and went on to the Second Continental Congress. There would be no turning back for John Adams or for the country. As president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and chairman of the Boston Committee of Safety, Joseph Warren next turned to recruiting and organizing soldiers for the siege of Boston. At the end of April, Captain Benedict Arnold arrived from Connecticut with news Warren wanted to hear. Fort Ticonderoga held artillery guarded by a weak garrison. Warren promptly ordered Arnold to mount an attack. Unbeknown to either man, another group from Connecticut was simultaneously enlisting Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys for the same purpose, making the Massachusetts effort redundant. Even though the Bay Colony Patriots desperately needed gunpowder, Warren supplied Arnold with 200 pounds for the mission. In mid-month, welcome news arrived from Lake Champlain. In the early morning hours of May 10th, more than 80 armed Americans had overrun the British garrison at Fort Ticonderoga. Almost 50 sleeping redcoats had surrendered without a fight, as had a smaller detachment at Crown Point the following day. 2 men led the raid in an uneasy collaboration, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Together, their action gave the Americans control of Lake Champlain, the traditional invasion route into or out of Canada. In mid-June, Boston's revolutionary leaders learned General Thomas Gage planned to send British regulars to seize the unoccupied hills surrounding the besieged town. On the night of Friday, June 16th, about 1,200 provincial soldiers stealthily occupied Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill and hastily erected earthworks. At a meeting of the Committee of Safety on the Cambridge Common the next morning, Joseph Warren learned British forces had landed at Charlestown. Around noon, Warren rode over to the American fortifications. Newly appointed as a major general, despite his lack of military experience, he arrived where the militia was forming and asked where the heaviest fighting would be. General Israel Putnam pointed to Breed's Hill. Warren volunteered to join the ranks as a private soldier against the wishes of Putnam and Colonel William Prescott, both of whom urged him to serve as their commander. He declined, believing they were the more experienced soldiers. Joseph Warren inspired his neighbors to hold their position against superior numbers. He declared of the British, "These fellows say we won't fight. By heaven, I hope I shall die up to my knees in blood." Warren fought on in the redoubt until the defenders' gunpowder was spent, holding fast long enough for his fellow citizen soldiers to withdraw before the British third and final assault overwhelmed the position. A British officer recognized him and shot him in the face with a pistol. The ball hit him below the left eye and blew through the back of his head. Joseph Warren died instantly, 6 days after his 34th birthday. 10 months later, his brothers and Paul Revere exhumed the body, which Revere identified by 2 artificial teeth he had wired into the doctor's jaw, the first recorded dental forensic identification of a body. File that away in your trivial knowledge. While more famous patriots were in Philadelphia, Warren remained in Massachusetts, helping orchestrate the reality of a revolution. His decision to send Benedict Arnold to the Champlain Valley may also have carried a bitter cost. Gunpowder used for that mission might have altered the course of events at Breed's Hill. In war, even necessary choices can leave a lasting shadow. Breed's Hill, the bloodiest battle of the War for Independence, occurred more than a year before independence was officially declared. British troops suffered more than 1,000 killed and wounded, nearly half of their attacking force. John Adams was in Philadelphia, attending Congress when the Battle of Breed's Hill was fought. He had warned Abigail, "In case of real danger, fly to the woods with our children." Instead, she watched from a hill in Braintree, with young John Quincy holding her hand. The next day she wrote, "Our dear friend, Dr. Warren, is no more, but fell gloriously fighting for his country." Years later, when Abigail first saw John Trumbull's painting of the battle, she said that her blood shivered. With a sharp mind and an argumentative personality, John Adams was a fierce advocate of independence. In the spring, his minded wife issued a declaration of her own. On March 31st, Abigail wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Way to go, Abigail. On June 11th, Congress appointed 5 men to draft a Declaration of Independence: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. 2 had ties to the Champlain Valley. Franklin had recently returned from a challenging diplomatic mission to Canada. Livingston's brother-in-law, General Richard Montgomery, had been killed being in an attack on Quebec in December 1775. Jefferson, then 33, took the lead and aimed, as he later said, not at originality, but at placing before mankind the common sense of the subject. He drafted quickly, then shared the text with Adams and Franklin for revision. The Committee of 5 presented the draft to Congress on June 28th, in the scene later made famous by John Trumbull. Many assume the painting shows the signing on July 4th. It doesn't. There was no formal signing ceremony that day. Even as Congress debated Jefferson's text, more than 100 British ships, carrying Generals Sir William Howe and 9,000 troops, were arriving off New York. On July 2nd, Congress voted for independence, with New York abstaining. Delegates revised the draft over the next 2 days, and on July 4th, the approved text went to the printer. New York joined the vote on July 9th, making independence unanimous. The Declaration of Independence is widely regarded as the defining statement of America's purpose. Abraham Lincoln returned to its meaning in the Gettysburg Address, delivered during the Civil War. Jefferson's 35 words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, remain among the most consequential in American history." Joseph Ellis called them the seminal statement of the American promise, and Walter Isaacson recently described the sentence as the greatest ever written. Declaring independence was one thing. Keeping it was another. By the summer of 1776, the question was no longer whether independence had been declared, but whether it could be preserved. And here the story turns north. While Congress gave the Revolution its clearest words, soldiers and sailors in the Champlain corridor had to keep those words from becoming dead letters. 20-year-old John Trumbull, later known as the painter of the Revolution, was appalled by the condition of the Northern Army at Crown Point in early July. "At this place," he later wrote, "I found not an army but a mob. The shattered remains of 12 or 15 very fine battalions, ruined by sickness, fatigue, and desertion, and void of every idea of discipline or subordination. A council of general officers voted to abandon Crown Point and concentrated a new post, soon named Mount Independence, across the lake from Ticonderoga. With 13,000 British and German troops under General Sir Guy Carleton preparing to move south from Canada, and a disorganized, badly outnumbered American army trying to hold the northern line, the campaign of 1776 turned on control of Lake Champlain. The lake was the invasion route, the supply line, and the strategic hinge of the Northern Theater. If the British gained control of the lake too quickly, they could drive south before the Americans were ready. In 1775, the Americans had seized and armed 4 vessels: the schooners Liberty, Revenge, and Royal Savage, and the sloop Enterprise. Those ships could delay a British advance, but only extraordinary skill and courage could make them decisive. The issue was no longer principle alone, but time. The task of building a war fleet at the Skenesboro shipyard, 20 miles below Ticonderoga, fell to Benedict Arnold, a fiery and highly capable 35-year-old former sea captain, among other things. Arnold's energy, leadership, and maritime skill made him the right man for the moment. He gathered carpenters, blacksmiths, and soldiers to build and crew the vessels under harsh conditions, turning scarce resources into a fighting fleet. Only liberal allowances of rum enabled the workers to endure swarms of giant mosquitoes drifting in from the surrounding swamps. When George Washington visited years later, Whitehall gained a reputation for having the largest and most voracious mosquitoes ever to bite the father of his country. The work was difficult, improvised, and urgent. By late summer, through sheer force of will, Arnold and his captains had assembled a makeshift squadron of schooners, gunboats, and galleys, crewed largely by inexperienced soldiers. Each gunboat carried a heavy single cannon in the bow, usually a 12-pounder, and a lighter cannon on each side, usually a 9-pounder. The galleys were longer than the gunboats, roughly 72 feet instead of 53 feet, and carried a heavier armament of 9 cannon, an 18-pounder in the bow, 2 12-pounders in the stern, and 3 6-pounders on each side. Notoriously poor sailors, the flat-bottomed, open-decked gunboats could be rowed with sweeps when necessary. Across the border at St. John's, Carleton and his subordinates assembled a larger, better built, and far better trained flotilla. Although spies had scouted the rebel shipyards during the summer, Arnold had no accurate estimate of the size of the British fleet until September 15th, nor until a day later did he have any inkling of the 3-masted ship Inflexible with her 18 12-pounder cannon. With this discouraging news in hand, Arnold changed his tactics from offense to defense. After carefully reconnoitering the lake, he chose the channel between Valcour Island and the western shore, and on September 23rd, moored his squadron there, describing the location as an exceeding fine, secure harbor. General David Waterbury and the galleys Trumbull, Congress, and Washington joined him. The second in command, Waterbury, was a Connecticut man like Arnold, a veteran of 6 campaigns in the French and Indian War, At 56 years of age, David Waterbury knew ships. Arnold assigned him to serve on the Washington Galley. Colonel Edward Wigglesworth, an experienced Massachusetts shipmaster and another Harvard graduate, was third in command. Arnold assigned him to serve on the Trumbull Galley. Snow fell as early as September 26th, dusting the decks of the American boats hidden behind Valcour Island and screened from the broad lake by the island's high pine-covered bluffs. Hardly a man to avoid combat, Arnold knew that on open water, British training and ship quality would prevail. So he chose the narrow channel to offset those advantages. If the north wind carried the British past Valcour, they would have to turn and attack in disorder, allowing the Americans to engage them ship by ship. Arnold planned to pick them off one by one. It was a shrewd position and his best chance. A fresh north wind carried the British fleet out of the Richelieu River as sunrise approached on Friday, October 11th. The leading vessels cleared Cumberland Head about 8 o'clock. Signal flags from the 14-gun schooner Lady Maria, the flagship, drew the other vessels into line of battle. The pine ridges of Valcour Island rose on the starboard bow. An instant later, a schooner appeared under full sail, followed closely by a tall-masted sloop and 3 galleys. Captain Thomas Pringle, Carleton's Commodore, ordered the signal to engage. It was close to 10 o'clock when the Lady Maria encountered the Royal Savage schooner, the sloop Enterprise, and the Congress, Washington, and Trumbull galleys, breaking out from behind Valcour Island. This was all part of Arnold's design. Warned earlier that morning that the British were approaching, he had shifted his flag from the Royal Savage to the Congress and sent the vessels forward as bait. Once the British ships committed to their turns, the American vessels came about and beat back behind the island. But then the Royal Savage caught a crossdraft. Her bows swung east and she ran aground, her masts crashing down on impact. It was a hard blow, and all of Arnold's personal papers were lost with her. Arnold's strategy forced the British to attack from the south. At first, the Americans fought on nearly equal terms, as the larger British vessels could not support the line of 24 British gunboats advancing under oars. As the day wore on, we all know, the American position deteriorated. By mid-afternoon, British cannon fire had inflicted serious punishment on Arnold's fleet. For those of you that like numbers, the 86 guns on the 15 American vessels could throw just over 600 pounds of metal in one salvo, compared with more than half a ton from the combined British vessels. Captain Pringle kept his flagship out of action, but when the Inflexible finally entered the fight and delivered 5 punishing broadsides, the uneven contest was decided. By day's end, the gunboat Philadelphia had sunk. General Carleton and Captain Pringle arranged their vessels in a loose line south of the passage between Valcour and the New York shore as darkness fell, expecting to accept Arnold's surrender in the morning. With the Inflexible in the center, the Lady Maria near shore, the heavily damaged Carleton to the east, and the Royal Convert gunboat patrolling to the rear, they believed their stoppers in the bottle were secure. Under the cover of heavy fog, however, Arnold and his captain slipped through the British line and escaped southward. The burning Royal Savage provided an unattended distraction as ghostly crews silently rowed to safety. Colonel Wigglesworth and the galley Trumbull leading the way, the gunboats following, a shrouded lantern at each vessel's stern, and the galleys Congress and Washington bringing up the rear. It was one of the boldest moments of the campaign. American sailors and Marines desperately sailed and rowed their battle-leading ships southward. The weakened gunboats Spitfire and Jersey were abandoned during the retreat. The fleet reached Schuyler Island, 8 miles below Valcour, where it anchored briefly to stop leaks in men's sails. Arnold, meanwhile, penned an account of the day's action for General Philip Schuyler. On the whole, I think we've made a very fortunate escape, he wrote. When the new day dawned in Valcour, the fog lifted on a British fleet confident it would soon finish the victory. Furious to find Arnold gone, Carleton launched a 36-hour pursuit. As they moved south, the British captured the abandoned gunboat Jersey. The gunboat Spitfire had already sunk to the deep lake bottom, where it still rests today, with its bow cannon in place and its mast standing tall. On October 13th, near Split Rock, the British fleet finally caught up with the ships straggling at the rear of the American line. Already heavily damaged, the Washington galley, with General Waterbury aboard, absorbed several British broadsides, then struck colors and surrendered. The British quickly gained on the Congress galley and the remaining American gunboats. For more than 2 hours, the powerful British ships chased Arnold and his captains in a running battle across Lake Champlain. Arnold sailed the Congress and the gunboats into Ferris Bay and Penton on the lake's eastern shore. Today it's Arnold's Bay. There, just ahead of the pursuing British, he beached and burned the vessels to deny them to the enemy. He then directed his men to march to Chimney Point, where boats carried them to Crown Point and then to Fort Ticonderoga. The British won control of the lake, but the season was too far advanced for an immediate strike against the American defenses at Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. Carleton therefore withdrew his invasion force to Canada for the winter. The fleet was lost, but the cause had gained what it needed most: time. So why does Valcour Island matter? Because there, in one of the Revolution's hardest hours, courage bought time, and time made survival possible. The battle did not deliver a conventional American victory. Far from it. It achieved something more important. It delayed the British advance and preserved the northern defenses. In that sense, Valcour Island stands at the hinge between declaration and endurance. And that is why this place deserves remembrance. It proves local sacrifice can alter national destiny. Perhaps Captain Peter Merrill of the Congress says it best. We didn't know it then, but on what we were doing depended the life of the Revolution and the very existence of what we know as freedom. Peter Merrill is a fictional character in Kenneth Roberts' memorable 1933 novel, Rabble in Arms, which I recommend wholeheartedly and wildly enthusiastically to any of you who haven't read it. The captain's words still ring true. I know the battle we fought at Valcour was momentous indeed, and that no force, great or small, ever lived to better purpose or died more gloriously than the force that manned Arnold's fleet on Lake Champlain. Some battles matter not because of their scale, but because of what they decide. That was true. Risked their lives, comfort, and liberty in a fleet of wooden ships and helped define the American nation. In the time left, and with your patience, let me bring these stories to a graceful end. August 1st, 1776, was a day of fasting in Massachusetts. The militant minister, William Emerson, preached from the text, "And if you go to war against the enemy, you shall blow the trumpet." He took his own sermon to heart and asked his congregation for permission to join the local company, then marching to defend the northern frontier. Permission was granted, and the father of five set out for Lake Champlain to serve as chaplain in the army of General Horatio Gates. Emerson's diary ends on August 7th with the entry, "This evening, about 9 o'clock, Mrs. Emerson delivered of a fine daughter, all thanks to our glorious and all-merciful God." According to family tradition, as William rode out through the gateway of the manse, he turned and waved goodbye to Phoebe and the children gathered at the front door. He stayed with friends and fellow ministers along the line of march and rode home whenever he could. "My dear Mrs. Emerson," he wrote, soon after arriving at the end of his 250-mile journey, "Ticonderoga is a most beautiful situation. Indeed, I'm charmed with the prospect. There are a number of very fine barracks in the fort, built of stone. In one of these I am at present stationed, where I want nothing to complete my satisfaction but my friends' company." A few weeks later, he wrote again in a shaky hand, "I am glad to embrace another opportunity to let you know, though I am not well, I have nothing more than a fever, and hope I shall be carried through what is called a seasoning of new soldiers." His fever, tragically, was dysentery. And on September 18th, just 24 days after his arrival, William Emerson obtained a medical discharge and set out for home. Near Rutland, and too sick to continue, he was taken to the home of a fellow minister. "I am now on my way homeward, but whether I shall ever reach there is very uncertain. I desire to leave you and our dear little ones to a kind and gracious Providence," he told Phoebe in his final letter on September 23rd. After lingering for almost a month in the family's log cabin on the west bank of the Otter Creek, William Emerson died. He was 33 years old. Emerson did not reach home, but he'd already given himself to the cause he believed was just. Phoebe, left with 5 children to raise, married William's successor as Concord's minister, and remained in the old manse until her death in 1825 at the age of 83. As the year 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence approached, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were invited to attend celebrations across the country. Though the time had long passed when the 90-year-old Adams or the 83-year-old Jefferson could leave home, both men were determined to live long enough to see one more 4th of July. Early on the morning of Tuesday, July 4th, as the first celebratory cannon sounded in the distance, John Adams awoke in his Quincy home. Told it was the 4th, the former president replied clearly, "It is a good day." At his home in Charlottesville, Thomas Jefferson had been unconscious since the night of July 2nd, while his daughter Martha kept a watch at his bedside. About 7 o'clock on the evening of July 3rd, Jefferson awoke and uttered his final declaration. This is the 4th. Told that it soon would be, he sank back to sleep and died at about 1 the next afternoon, July 4th. At Quincy, the roar of cannon grew louder as the hours passed. Late in the afternoon, Adams stirred and whispered clearly enough to be understood, "Thomas Jefferson survives." About 6:20, his heart stopped. John Adams was dead. That Adams and Jefferson died on the same day, and it was, of all days, the 4th of July, struck many Americans as more than just a coincidence. President John Quincy Adams, writing in his diary that night, called it a visible and palpable manifestation of divine favor, giving voice to what many felt as the news spread across the young republic. A decade later, in 1836, William and Phoebe Emerson's grandson was living in the Old Manse. Looking out over the battle site, the 33-year-old philosopher composed a declaration of intellectual independence. "Build therefore your own world," Ralph Waldo Emerson urged his countrymen in his seminal essay, Nature. The younger Emerson left the ministry to pursue writing and public speaking and became one of the best-known American figures of the 19th century. He wrote Concord Hymn for the July 4th, 1837 dedication of the memorial. Its first verse reads, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world." The poem gave the world the phrase, "the shot heard round the world," the line for which Ralph Waldo Emerson is best remembered. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here this evening. There's nothing I like more than a captive audience. There's one truth that I hope you carry with you when you leave. It's this: liberty is never simply given, and liberty is never permanently secure. It must be imagined by brave minds, declared with conviction, defended with sacrifice, and sustained by each generation in turn. That was the work of John and Abigail Adams, of Joseph Warren, of William Emerson, and of the weary, unyielding men who fought on Lake Champlain. That is why this story endures. It reminds us that national destinies can turn on the courage of ordinary people. And it reminds us that this region, and Valcour Island above all, stands firmly within the great story of American freedom. In every age, history is made when men and women accept the burdens of their moment. What they preserve, we inherit. What we preserve, we pass on. Thanks again. If anybody has any really easy questions, I'll catch them.
who's here with a commemorative mug from Florence with the
Thank you very much.
Briefly, our next program will be a presentation on the life and work of Judge Matthew Adgate, paying particular attention to his work during the Revolutionary War. As some of you may know, Matthew Adgate is buried just up the road here in Osceola County Cemetery. That program will be here on Wednesday, August 19th at 7 o'clock, and we hope to see you then.